The year 2024 began quietly, the way years sometimes do when something enormous is already moving beneath the surface, invisible and gathering strength. Christmas had barely passed. The Middleton family had gathered in Sandringham on December 25th, 2023, and photographs taken that morning showed Catherine, Princess of Wales, standing tall in the Norfolk chill, her 3 children arranged beside her, everyone smiling. She looked well. She looked like herself. Nobody watching those photographs. Not the journalists, not the royal correspondents, not the millions of people who followed the family's every public movement, had any reason to believe that in a matter of weeks, the British royal family would be standing in the middle of the most frightening period of its modern history. Catherine was admitted to the London clinic in January 2024. Kensington Palace released a careful statement. She had undergone planned abdominal surgery. The condition was not cancerous, the palace said. She would need 2 weeks in hospital, and then a period of recovery at home. The public should not expect to see her until after Easter. It was the kind of statement that said just enough to satisfy immediate curiosity, while closing the door firmly on anything further. The palace had always been cautious with medical information, guarding it as though the details of a royal body were a matter of state security. Nobody thought much of it at first. Surgeries happen. Recoveries take time. The world moved on. But Catherine did not come back. Weeks passed, then more weeks. Easter came and went. She was not at Trooping the Color. She was not photographed on any of the school runs she had occasionally been spotted doing near their Windsor home. She was not opening anything, visiting anything, attending anything. For a woman who had been one of the most photographed people on the planet for over a decade, the silence was deafening. And into that silence, so the internet poured everything it had. Conspiracy theories bloomed the way they always do when powerful institutions offer no information and people are left to fill the space themselves. Some were benign and sad. Some were grotesque. There were theories that she had left William, that she was gravely ill, that she had died and was being hidden, that some unspecified scandal had forced her out of public life. Photographs were analyzed pixel by pixel, and old videos were slowed down and examined for supposed clues. The machine of speculation ran continuously, day and night, fueled by the fact that nobody in any official position was saying anything useful at all. William, meanwhile, was still appearing in public. He attended engagements. He shook hands, visited charities, gave brief remarks at events. But he looked different. There was something behind his eyes at certain moments, a distance, a weight that royal observers could not quite name. When a reporter managed to ask him how Kate was doing, he smiled and said she was doing well. It was the kind of answer that technically answered nothing. His press team told journalists that his focus was on his work and not on social media, a statement so pointed it barely disguised the exhaustion underneath it. Then, at the beginning of February, something happened that changed the entire shape of the story. Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles III had been diagnosed with cancer. The diagnosis had been discovered during a procedure he had undergone for an enlarged prostate. The prostate issue was benign, the palace said, but during the course of that treatment, cancer had been found. He would step back immediately from all public-facing duties to concentrate on his treatment. The palace did not reveal what type of cancer it was. It did not say how serious it was. It said only that the king was receiving treatment and that doctors were hopeful. The Britain absorbed this news with the strange combination of alarm and composure that the British tend to apply to national shocks. Charles had only been on the throne for about 17 months. The country had barely finished grieving Queen Elizabeth II, who had died in September 2022 after 70 years on the throne. The transition had been tender and unsteady, as transitions always are when a beloved monarch passes. And now the new king, still finding his footing, and still working out what his version of the monarchy would look like, was sick. His wife, Queen Camilla, stepped forward to take on more engagements. Princess Anne, who had always been one of the hardest-working members of the family, added more to her already relentless schedule. Prince Edward and his wife Sophie did the same. And then there was William. William, who was already worried sick about his wife at home, who was managing 3 young children while Catherine recovered from surgery, who was watching his father navigate a cancer diagnosis, was suddenly also the most prominent working royal in the country. The king could not do his full schedule. Catherine could not do any schedule. Harry and Meghan had stepped away from royal duties in 2020 and were living in California, largely estranged from the family. Andrew had been stripped of his royal role years earlier, following the scandal surrounding his association with Jeffrey Epstein. The working royal family, at that particular moment in early 2024, was extraordinarily thin, and the man standing at the center of it, holding it together by showing up every single day, was William. He attended a gala for London's air ambulance charity on February 7th. He had not been seen at a formal royal event since before Christmas. When he walked into that room, people watched him carefully for signs of how things really were. He thanked the crowd for the support they had shown his father and his wife. He said it meant more than he could say. He kept his voice steady. He looked like a man who had decided, perhaps very deliberately, that steadiness was the only thing he could offer the moment, because everything else was out of his control. The palace was managing 2 health crises simultaneously, neither of which it could fully explain to the public without breaching the medical privacies of 2 of its most important members. It was an impossible position. The press wanted information, so the public wanted reassurance, and every day that passed without an update fed the speculation further, made it louder, made it darker. When a Mother's Day photograph was released by Kensington Palace in March, showing Catherine with her 3 children, it was supposed to offer some quiet proof that she was alive and recovering and surrounded by her family. Instead, it backfired badly. Photo agencies including the Associated Press, Reuters, AFP, and Getty Images all withdrew the image after detecting signs of digital manipulation. Catherine later admitted she had edited the photograph and apologized for the confusion it caused. The timing could not have been worse. The retraction hit the internet at exactly the moment when distrust was already at its highest. And within hours, the image had become the subject of analysis so intense, it seemed like the whole world had turned into amateur forensic investigators. The palace's attempt at reassurance had, through a small and thoroughly human error, produced the opposite of reassurance. What few people knew at the time was that the London clinic, the private hospital where Catherine had undergone her surgery, had launched an internal investigation after reports emerged that staff members may have attempted to illegally access her private medical records. 3 people were said to be under investigation. The information, when it eventually leaked out, added another layer of unease to an already unsettling few months. Catherine was trying to recover from major surgery in private, and even that privacy was being tested. For William, each of these events was not an abstraction. It was not a news story. It was his wife's medical records being potentially accessed by unauthorized people. It was his father in a cancer ward. It was his children asking questions he did not yet know how to answer. According to what later emerged in royal biographer Robert Jobson's book, The Windsor Legacy, William was shaken to his core by everything happening around him at once. He reportedly asked King Charles, his ailing father, whether it might be possible for him to scale back his public duties even slightly, to focus on supporting Catherine and the children through this period. Charles, understanding perhaps better than anyone what it meant to carry duty through personal suffering, told his son simply to think again. The royal machine did not pause. It could not afford to. And so William, steadied by a father who would not let him falter, went back to work. He returned to official public duties on a Thursday in April, visiting organizations in West London and Surrey. It was a modest schedule. But the photographs taken that day showed something that had not been visible in weeks. He looked present. He looked like he had decided something privately, on somewhere between February and April, about what this year was going to demand of him and how he was going to meet it. A royal source told the press that his approach going forward would be to carry out engagements when his children were at school, keeping family life as protected as he possibly could. George, Charlotte, and Louis were 10, 8, and 5 years old. They were at an age where they understood more than children are sometimes credited with understanding, and William and Catherine were determined that whatever storms were gathering outside the walls of their home, those 3 children would feel stability inside them. The picture of the royal family in the first 3 months of 2024 was one that nobody had anticipated. The king was ill. The future queen was ill. The palace was managing silence and speculation in almost equal measure. And standing in the space where the senior working royals had always stood, slightly taller than he had perhaps expected to be at this point in his life, was William. He was 41 years old. He had spent his entire life preparing for a role he would not technically hold for years yet. But the rehearsal had just ended without warning, and the performance had begun. Catherine, at home in Windsor, was not idle even in her recovery. She was present for her children in the way she had always insisted on being. The school pickups where possible, the kitchen table conversations, the ordinary texture of family life that she and William had always fought hard to protect. Friends who knew her well described a woman who was frustrated by her body's limitations, but deeply determined not to let those limitations define the household around her. She had always been the kind of person who moved through difficulty by finding something useful to do with it. She was, even in illness, already thinking about what came next. The Easter holidays began. The children came home from school, and it was then, on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2024, that a video appeared on the official Kensington Palace social media channels. Catherine was sitting outdoors, the English countryside soft behind her, dressed simply. She looked directly at the camera, and she told the world, in her own words, with extraordinary composure, what had been happening. She had undergone the surgery in January, believing her condition was not cancerous. The surgery had been successful, but tests carried out afterward had found that cancer had been present. Her doctors had advised a course of preventative chemotherapy, which she had begun in late February. She described it as a huge shock. She thanked William, describing him as a great source of comfort and strength. She asked for time, space, and privacy for her family. She ended by saying something that would be quoted in newspapers and read aloud on radio programs and shared across every platform for days afterward. To everyone facing this disease, in whatever form, she said, "Please do not lose faith or hope. You are not alone." She was 42 years old. She had 3 children under 11. She had been a member of the royal family for 13 years, and she had just told the entire world that she had cancer in a 2-minute video, filmed by BBC Studios at Windsor, with the steadiness of someone who had decided that the only thing she could control in all of this was how she chose to speak about it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. King Charles said he was so proud of his beloved daughter-in-law and her courage in speaking as she had. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called it tremendous bravery and added that she had been unfairly treated during the weeks of speculation that had preceded the announcement. The White House released a statement. Leaders from across the world sent messages. Harry and Meghan released a joint statement wishing the family health, healing, and privacy. Britain's newspapers the following morning carried her face on nearly every front page. The Times ran the headline, "Princess reveals her cancer and says, 'I'm going to be okay.'" For the first time in months, the silence was broken. And in breaking it, something shifted. The speculation stopped. but not because it had been satisfied, but because Catherine herself had made it irrelevant. She had stepped past it, directly, on her own terms, and spoken plainly about something terrifying in a way that reminded everyone watching why she had become, over 13 years, one of the most trusted and admired members of the royal family. It was not the message anyone had wanted to receive, but the way it was delivered was something people would not forget for a long time. The year had barely reached spring, and already it had demanded more of William and Catherine than most people face in a decade, and they were only at the beginning. After the video was released on March 22nd, Britain spent the following days in a state of collective quiet that was unusual for a country that rarely stays quiet about anything. The jokes stopped. The conspiracy forums went silent, or at least grew embarrassed and dispersed. On newspapers that had spent weeks running breathless speculative pieces about Catherine's whereabouts, pivoted overnight to writing about her courage. Editorials appeared arguing that the weeks of scrutiny and unfounded theorizing had been a failure of public decency, that a woman recovering from major surgery had been subjected to something that no private citizen would ever have had to endure. The admission felt like a kind of national exhale, to the release of a breath that had been held far too long. But Catherine was still sick. The country's sympathy, however genuine, did not change that. The chemotherapy had begun in late February. She was weeks into it by the time she filmed the video. Anyone who has watched someone close to them go through chemotherapy understands that the word itself is almost too clinical to describe what the experience actually involves. The treatment attacks the body comprehensively. It does not distinguish between the cells it is meant to destroy and the ones it needs to preserve. It leaves people exhausted in a way that sleep cannot fix, nauseated in a way that food cannot resolve, stripped of physical confidence in ways that go well beyond the visible and outward signs most people associate with cancer treatment. Catherine was enduring all of this inside the relative quiet of their Windsor home, away from cameras, supported by William and her parents, a Michael and Carol Middleton, who were said to be a constant presence throughout the weeks of her treatment. William, in the meantime, was constructing something that resembled a normal life, from materials that kept shifting beneath him. He dropped the children at school. He attended engagements. He sat through briefings and meetings and formal dinners where people watched him carefully to see if the composure might crack, and it did not. He was, by all accounts from those who observed him in this period, extraordinarily controlled. Not cold, not detached, but controlled in the way that people are when they understand that losing control is a luxury they cannot afford. The royal machine required someone to keep it visible and functioning. The king was in treatment. Catherine was in treatment. And the role of keeping the public face of the monarchy steady had fallen to him in a way that had no precedent in his lifetime. His schedule in these months was not light. Kensington Palace structured his engagements carefully, concentrating them in the hours when the children were at school, protecting evenings and weekends as much as the demands of royal duty allowed. He visited organizations in West London. He attended the Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey in March, standing beside Queen Camilla. He fulfilled the obligations that had been planned months earlier, turning up, doing the work, representing the institution that he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. Occasionally, something human broke through. At events, when members of the public expressed their concern for his family, he would pause and thank them with a sincerity that was clearly not diplomatic and not rehearsed. The emotion was real. It sat just below the surface, visible to anyone looking for it. And though he never let it spill over into anything that might have read as vulnerability in the way the press would have amplified. The conspiracies that had swirled around Catherine's absence did not entirely disappear after her announcement. Some corners of the internet continued to ask questions. The manipulated Mother's Day photograph, with its already unfortunate timing, remained a touchstone for those who distrusted the palace's version of events. Then, further complicating matters, it emerged that staff at the London clinic had reportedly attempted to access Catherine's private medical notes without authorization. 3 staff members were said to be under investigation. The news, when it reached the public, carried an ugliness that felt particular and specific. The idea that Catherine's medical vulnerability had been treated as an opportunity for intrusion, that even the privacy of a hospital room was not guaranteed. For William, who had fought fiercely for his family's right to a private life since before he and Catherine were married, since the years when he watched his mother's privacy being systematically destroyed, this was not an abstraction. It was a direct echo of patterns he had spent years trying to prevent. Catherine's mother, Carol, had always been a steadying force in her daughter's life. The Middletons were an unusually close family, for one connected to the royal house, and they made no apologies for it. Carol arrived at Windsor regularly throughout the treatment months, bringing with her the particular comfort of someone who had known Catherine since she was born, and who was not daunted by royal protocol or the formality of their situation. Michael Middleton was there too. They cooked. They managed the rhythms of a household with 3 children who needed feeding and helping with homework and putting to bed. Children who were old enough to understand that something serious was happening with their mother, even if the full details had been protected from them as much as possible. George was 10. Charlotte was 8. Louis was 5. Each of them was at a different stage of comprehension. William and Catherine had agreed from the beginning that the children needed to know enough to understand why things were different, why Mummy was tired some days and needed to rest, why there were more doctors around than usual, why the household was operating with a slightly unfamiliar quietness. They did not want them to find out through a news headline or a classmate's careless remark. They told them in the way that parents who have thought carefully about something tell their children, gently, honestly, with enough information to prevent fear from filling the gaps, and without burdening them with more than they could carry. William and Catherine had apparently waited until the school Easter holidays began before making the public announcement, specifically so that the children would be home, away from school, shielded from the immediate media storm that the video would generate, in the relative safety of their own house. Spring moved into early summer. Catherine, from home, began appearing in small ways. There were photographs released by the palace, a written Instagram post in June, carefully worded, a deeply personal, offered the first update since the announcement. She was making good progress, she wrote, but as anyone going through chemotherapy knows, there are good days and bad days. On the bad days, she wrote, you feel weak and tired, and you have to give in to your body resting. On the good days, when you feel stronger, you want to make the most of feeling well. It was a window into what the months had actually looked like inside the quiet of their home. No performance, no palace speak, on just an honest account of a hard thing, written in plain language, and it reached people directly in the way plain language always does. The post drew responses from hundreds of thousands of people who had been through chemotherapy themselves or watched someone they loved go through it. The recognition was immediate and enormous. Here was someone at the absolute summit of public life, describing the exact specific reality of a cancer treatment that millions of ordinary people had experienced, and describing it without euphemism or distance. That was something Catherine had always understood instinctively about her role, that the moment of genuine connection was not the grand occasion or the formal visit, but the point at which something human and unguarded surfaced through the formality, and people recognized themselves in it. Then came June, and with it, the moment the public had been waiting for since January. On a Trooping the Color is the annual ceremony that marks the sovereign's official birthday. It involves soldiers in scarlet uniforms marching through central London, a military procession of considerable precision and pageantry, ending with the royal family appearing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to watch a Royal Air Force fly past. It is one of the most visible moments in the royal calendar, the kind of event that signals continuity and the ongoing presence of the institution and its most prominent members. Catherine had not been seen in a significant public setting since the Christmas service in Sandringham 6 months earlier. William had attended the ceremony in June 2023, as had Catherine. In June 2024, the question was whether she would be well enough to attend. She was. She arrived in a carriage. She was wearing a white dress. She looked different, and thinner in a way that the cameras showed clearly and the commentators noted carefully. But she was there. She was present, upright, composed, waving to the crowds that lined the processional route. When the royal family gathered on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and the RAF aircraft appeared overhead, she stood with William and the children and looked up. The roar from the crowd below when she appeared was audible on broadcast television. People cheered. They had been waiting a long time to see that she was still standing. King Charles also participated in the ceremony, though in modified form. He rode in a horse-drawn carriage alongside Queen Camilla rather than on horseback, which had always been his tradition. He too had been largely absent from public view since his diagnosis, and his appearance alongside Catherine at this particular ceremony carried a significance that went beyond the tradition itself. These were 2 members of the royal family who were simultaneously fighting serious illness, and they had come out on the same day to stand in front of the country and be seen. It was not a political statement. It was not a media strategy, or at least it was not only those things. It was also something simpler. 2 people in difficult circumstances choosing to show up, which is a thing that means something regardless of who is doing it. A few weeks later, in July, Catherine appeared again. This time, it was Wimbledon. She is a patron of the All England Club and has attended the championships for many years, usually watching from the royal box, occasionally presenting the trophies at the end of the tournament. In 2024, she appeared in the royal box for the men's singles final and received a standing ovation from the entire crowd. She was with her daughter Charlotte. She watched the match. She smiled. The standing ovation, captured on camera and broadcast across the world, and I said something that no official statement could have said more clearly. These were not people following a princess out of duty or protocol. These were people genuinely glad that she was alive and present and sitting in that chair in the July afternoon. For William, watching his wife receive that standing ovation, there was something in that moment that had been missing from the previous months. The months before had demanded a kind of endurance that left little room for relief or joy. What he had been in motion, managing, balancing, carrying, without the ability to stop long enough to register what any of it was costing him. The Wimbledon moment was different. It was a moment of something that resembled ordinary life, a summer afternoon, a tennis match, his daughter beside his wife, the crowd on its feet. However briefly, it was possible to believe that ordinary life was coming back. It was not back entirely. Catherine was still in chemotherapy. The treatment continued through the summer. There were good days and bad ones, as she had written. William continued his schedule, arranging everything around the children's school timetable, continuing to carry the public visibility of the family through a period when the king was still limited in what he could do. In Africa, in November, at the end of a 4-day visit to South Africa for his Earthshot Prize initiative, William spoke to reporters in a way he had not quite allowed himself to speak before. He described 2024 as probably the hardest year of his life. He said it had been brutal. He said that trying to get through everything else and keep everything on track had been really difficult. He said he was so proud of his wife and so proud of his father. He said the support the family had received from the public had been extraordinary. He sounded like a man who had carried something very heavy for a very long time, and was only just beginning to set a small part of it down. The Earthshot Prize was important to William in a way that went beyond the prestige of the event. He had founded it in 2020 with the aim of using the model of the X Prize and the Apollo program to incentivize global solutions to environmental challenges, awarding £5 million prizes each year to projects addressing climate change, protecting nature, to cleaning air and water, and building sustainable cities. The ceremony in Cape Town was the fourth such event that William had insisted on attending, had made the trip to South Africa, had stood on the stage and presented the awards to the winning teams, even in the middle of everything his family was enduring, said something about the relationship he had built with the work. It was not separate from his identity as a husband and father and future king. It was part of the same commitment. A man who understood that the world his children would inherit was shaped by decisions made now, and who was unwilling to let personal crisis become a reason to stop showing up for those decisions. By September 2024, Catherine had finished her chemotherapy. The announcement came through a video released by Kensington Palace, filmed in Norfolk in August, showing her with William and all 3 children. She is shown laughing, standing in the open air, but looking like herself in a way that was noticeably different from the careful, composed figure of the March announcement. The video had a different quality to it, looser, more unguarded, as though whoever filmed it had captured something rather than staged it. She spoke directly about what the experience had been like. The cancer journey, she said, is complex, scary, and unpredictable for everyone, especially those closest to you. With humility, she said, so it brings you face to face with your own vulnerabilities in a way you have never considered before. She said the experience had reminded her and William to be grateful for the simple and important things in life, of simply loving and being loved. She finished chemotherapy. Her path to full recovery, she said, was still long. But the chemotherapy was done. The word remission is a complicated word. It does not mean cured. It does not mean finished. Or it does not mean that the fear goes away, or that the watchfulness stops, or that the body feels immediately like itself again. What it means, in the most precise medical sense, is that the signs of cancer are no longer detectable, that the treatment has done what it was designed to do, and that the person who received it can begin the slower, stranger work of learning to live in the aftermath. For Catherine, that aftermath began in the autumn of 2024, and it turned out to be its own kind of challenge, separate from the challenge of being sick, but connected to it in ways she had not fully anticipated. She said as much herself, with a directness that by now had become characteristic of how she chose to communicate during this period. At a hospital visit later in her recovery, speaking to patients and staff, she described what it felt like to finish treatment and discover that getting back to normal was not a straight line. You put on a sort of brave face through treatment, she said. Then treatment is done, and you think you can just crack on and get back to normal. But actually, that's not the case. The adjustment was real, unglamorous, and ongoing. She was still managing fatigue. She still could not function at home in the way she once had. The new normal, she said, takes time. It is a roller coaster. It is not smooth the way you expect it to be. What was remarkable about these admissions was not simply that they were honest, but that they were useful. Catherine was talking, in plain language, to millions of people who were going through exactly the same thing. People who had finished treatment and found themselves in the confusing space afterward. People who felt guilty for not feeling better faster. And people who had been told they were brave for getting through chemotherapy, and who now felt privately bewildered by how hard the recovery was. She gave those people something specific and valuable. The public acknowledgement of a person with enormous visibility that the hardest part of a cancer experience is not always the treatment itself. It can be everything that comes after. When the immediate crisis has passed and the world expects you to return, and you discover that return is a destination you have to earn slowly and on the body's own terms. She appeared in public for the first time after the announcement that her chemotherapy had ended in September 2024, attending an engagement focused on early years education, a cause she had championed for years. Then, in mid-October, she and William visited Southport, a town in northwest England that had been devastated by a knife attack in July. A 17-year-old had attacked a group of children at a dance class, killing 3 girls and injuring several more. The attack had sent shockwaves through the country in a way that few events do. The particular horror of very young children being killed in a place where they were meant to be safe, doing something as innocent as a dance class on a summer morning. Catherine and William met with the parents of the victims and with the emergency services workers who had responded to the scene. So they sat with grieving people and they listened. They did not offer the usual formal condolences from a polished distance. They sat close. They leaned in. Photographs from the visit showed both of them with expressions that were not composed in the diplomatic way that such visits sometimes are. They looked like 2 people genuinely affected by what they were hearing, which is what they were. The Southport visit said something important about who Catherine and William had become by late 2024. The year had put them through an experience that left few places to hide behind formality or performance. When you have spent months as a private person dealing with cancer treatment, when your husband has spent months carrying professional responsibility while managing personal fear that he could not show to the world, you come out the other side of that with your pretenses somewhat worn down. What remained was something more direct and more human. The Southport families apparently felt it. The visit was described by those who were there as something different from the standard royal engagement, something warmer, something that felt less like an official call and more like 2 people who understood, at least in part, what it was to be afraid and not know the outcome. Back in London, the royal family continued to manage the broader pressures that had been present throughout the year. King Charles, who had resumed a modified public schedule in April, continued his treatment while carrying out engagements, an act of sustained personal willpower that his son had watched closely all year. Charles was patron of Cancer Research UK and had visited cancer patients at treatment centers, a decision that turned his own diagnosis from a private crisis into something potentially useful, a way of drawing public attention to cancer experiences and removing some of the silence that still surrounds them. William had watched his father do this throughout 2024 and spoken with evident pride about it in November. He was so proud, he said in South Africa, of how his father had handled things. The relationship between William and Charles, always complicated by the pressures of succession and the peculiarities of their position, had been quietly reshaped by the year's events. A son watching his father battle cancer, or a father watching his son carry an unprecedented weight of responsibility without complaint. 2 men in positions that allow very little room for ordinary human conversation about fear or grief or the desire to just stop for a moment, had found in the shared difficulty of 2024 a kind of closeness that is easier to feel than to describe. When Charles had told William to think again in response to his son's request to reduce engagements, it was not a cold refusal. It was a father who understood the cost of duty from decades of personal experience, telling his son that the cost was real, but that paying it was what they did. William went back to work, and somewhere in that dynamic was something that strengthened rather than fractured them. The other family fracture, the one that had preceded 2024 by several years, was not healed by the year's events, but was in some ways made more visible by them. Prince Harry, who had stepped away from royal duties in 2020 and was living in California with Meghan and their 2 children, Archie and Lilibet, remained distant. Harry and Meghan had released a statement when Catherine's cancer was announced, wishing her health and healing and privacy. It was warm in its wording and widely reported, but the estrangement was real and ongoing. Harry had been locked in legal battles with various British institutions for years, and in October 2025, he would name William and Catherine in a court case involving claims about the use of private investigators. The rift showed no signs of the kind of reconciliation that both sides occasionally said they wanted. Charles had met Harry privately in September 2024, their first meeting in almost 2 years. William was not present. Whatever happened in that meeting remained private. The public version was simply that a father and son who had been estranged had sat in the same room together for a brief time, and then Harry had left again. William's feelings about Harry were not something he addressed publicly in any specific way. He had spent years refusing to litigate the estrangement in the press, declining interviews on the subject, directing all questions about it through official channels that said as little as possible. In a year as difficult as 2024, the absence of his only brother was simply another weight in an already very heavy load. It was not something he discussed, but it was there. As winter arrived and December came around, Catherine's carol concert returned to Westminster Abbey. She had hosted it every year since 2021, and it had become one of the most personal events in the royal calendar, more intimate in its atmosphere than the formal occasions, reflecting her own taste and priorities. The 2024 concert carried particular emotional weight. Its theme, as described by those involved, was love and empathy in the darkest times. For a woman who had spent much of the year in what might genuinely be called a dark time, the choice of theme felt deeply personal and not at all accidental. She stood at Westminster Abbey in December, and she was present, and that presence alone meant something to the people in the pews and to the people watching at home. January 2025 brought the formal confirmation. Catherine visited the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust in London, the hospital where she had received her cancer treatment, and announced on Instagram that she was in remission. She described herself as still adjusting to a new normal. She thanked the hospital staff. She and William became joint patrons of the Royal Marsden that same day, a gesture that turned the place of her treatment into a place of ongoing commitment, a way of converting a personal crisis into something outward-facing and purposeful. The photograph from that visit, shared on social media, showed her in the hospital talking to patients, smiling, present, not performing recovery, actually recovering, and in recovery, turning toward others who were still in the middle of the journey she had completed. The word remission, when it arrived officially in January 2025, felt different from the word people had been waiting for since March 2024, and it was quieter than the announcement of her diagnosis had been. It did not generate the same global wave of press coverage, the same front-page headlines, the same avalanche of official statements from prime ministers and presidents. It was, instead, received the way good news after a long struggle tends to be received. With relief that has been waiting so long, it has gone quiet. People who had followed the story closely felt something settle. Not triumph, not celebration exactly, but a measured exhale. She was going to be all right. What the year had asked of William and Catherine, taken together, was something that no job description and no amount of preparation could have anticipated. It had asked Catherine to be seriously ill in public, to manage her own fear and her children's worry and her husband's grief while her body was being treated for cancer. It had asked her to be honest about it in a way that royal institutions are not traditionally honest about private suffering. And it had asked her to do all of this while the world watched and speculated and occasionally behaved in ways that were intrusive or unkind. She had done it. She had done it without losing the particular quality that had made people trust her for over a decade. That quality of being genuinely herself in a role that tends to flatten people into something more like a symbol. And it had asked William to carry the public face of the monarchy through a period when the two people beside him in that role were both too ill to carry it with him. It had asked him to show up every day for work while managing fear about his wife and grief about his father and the ordinary exhausting demands of raising 3 children under 11. It had asked him to do this without complaining, without cracking, without retreating into the kind of detachment that difficult circumstances sometimes produce in people who feel they cannot afford to feel things fully. He had done it. He had shown up. He had thanked people genuinely when they expressed concern. He had gone to South Africa and presented prizes and described the year as brutal and made no attempt to dress that description up into something more palatably regal. Together, they had demonstrated something that was harder to perform than any ceremonial duty and more meaningful than any official engagement. They had demonstrated that the reasons people invest emotionally in public figures are not really about the ceremony or the palaces or the clothes. They are about character. They are about what people do when things are genuinely hard, how they treat the people around them, whether they show up, whether they tell the truth, whether they allow themselves to be human when the easier and safer thing would be to hide behind the role. The royal family, by the time 2024 ended, was changed in ways that were difficult to catalog completely. It was thinner in membership than it had been before Harry and Meghan's departure, more exposed to the gaps left by illness and estrangement, and the limitations that come with age and treatment. But at its center, where Catherine and William stood, there was something that had not been weakened by the year's events. It had been made more visible by them. The partnership between them, which had been easy to take for granted through the years of smooth public appearances and well-managed engagements, had been tested in a way that tests actually test things. It had held. More than held. It had been revealed as something genuinely foundational. A marriage between two people who had chosen each other before they fully understood what that choice would cost them, and who had demonstrated in 2024 exactly what that choice was worth. Catherine's return to public life continued into 2025, carefully and on her own terms. She still pulled out of planned appearances when her energy required it. The Royal Ascot, which she had been expected to attend in 2025, saw her step back at the last moment, with Kensington Palace noting that she was still working out the right balance following her cancer battle. This was not a setback in the way it might once have been reported. It was simply the reality of a person who was honest about what she could and could not manage, who had not slipped back into the old pattern of pushing through everything regardless of cost. The year had taught her something about limits and about the value of respecting them, and she was applying that lesson, and the world could wait. She would show up when she was ready. She had earned the right to take that time. William, who would one day be king, had spent 2024 learning something about the weight of that future in real and immediate terms. Not as a concept, not as a preparation, but as something he was living through day after day, in the knowledge that the crown he would eventually wear was not a reward, but a responsibility, one that did not pause for illness or fear or personal grief, one that required him to be present even when presence was the hardest thing in the world to maintain. He had maintained it, and in maintaining it, he had shown something about what kind of king he intended to be. Not a distant ceremonial figure, but a man who understood that the monarchy's value to the country it served was measured not in tradition or spectacle, but in character, in showing up, in being human, in being honest, in not looking away from hard things. Not by the time the first months of 2025 had settled, The image of 2024 that remained most clearly was not of grand state occasions or formal ceremonies. It was of a man dropping his children at school in the morning before going to do a job he could not step away from. It was of a woman sitting in front of a camera on a quiet afternoon in March and telling the truth. It was of two people walking into a community hall in Southport and sitting down with parents whose children were gone, and being, on for that hour, just two people listening. It was of a standing ovation at Wimbledon on a summer afternoon, and the look on Catherine's face in that moment, which was the look of someone who was still here, who had come through something, and who was not finished yet. They had remained unshaken, not because they were made of different material than the rest of us, not because their circumstances insulated them from the weight of what they were carrying. They had remained unshaken because they had chosen, daily, to hold steady. And that choice, quiet and constant, and made in the absence of any audience, was the most royal thing about them.